Hello, hello. I am here for my live podcast on HR expert opinion on returning back to work with Kimberly Prescott. And I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes to join in to the conversation because I want you all to not miss any of this because it's going to be a great conversation and a discussion. And after a few people have joined in, I will go and introduce my special guest, which is Ms. Kimberly Prescott. And I just want to thank you all for being here. This is my first time doing a live podcast. I guess a live video podcast. I've done a live audio one through my podcasting network, but I always do live conversations in the SOAR circle. So I thought it would be great to do a live podcast interview in the SOAR circle as part of the conversation, just adding more content and more value, and always looking for conversations that are important to us as professional Black women. So thank you, everybody who RSVP'd and said they were attending. We had lots of engagement and lots of feedback. Everybody's interested in this topic. It's a hot topic. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our special guest, Kimberly Prescott. Kimberly Prescott is the founder and president of Prescott HR, an outsourced human resources consulting firm based in Columbia, Maryland. Kimberly is practiced at assisting clients with developing a strong internal management and human resources structure during periods of organizational change and or rapid growth. She is also adept at creating and defining HR departments and practices from the ground up. Kimberly brings over 2 decades of experience from previous HR leadership and director positions, including at Whole Foods, Social Solutions, Maxim Healthcare Services, and TEK Systems. Community and giving back are important to Kimberly. Among others, she is the current board chair for the Community Foundation of Howard County, Maryland, and she is a pro bono consultant with the Taproot Foundation. Kimberly holds the Senior Human Resources Professional, which is SPHR, and the Senior Certified Professional, which is SHRM SCP certifications. She attended the University of Maryland, University College, and studied human resources management. So, without further ado, I would love to welcome Kimberly Prescott.
God.
Welcome, Kimberly.
Welcome, Kimberly. Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And that introduction was great. I'm like, oh, I hope I can live up to this.
Oh, most definitely.
Most definitely.
So, I
So
just
I
would
just
like to
would like,
let people know how we met and how this topic sort of came up. So, I met Kimberly at an event that was hosted by The Third. And The Third is an organization that supports women of color entrepreneurs in Howard County. And so it was a cocktails and candles a celebration. And when I heard Kimberly speak and she talked about her business and she talked about HR and she also whipped up some amazing cocktails, I was like very impressed. And so when I thought about this topic, because a lot of people, as a physician, I've been working throughout the pandemic, but a lot of people have mentioned to me that there was some anxiety or angst about returning to work after the pandemic. And so I thought that would be a great conversation for us to have as a community. And when I thought about having that conversation, you were the first person who came to mind as being an expert who could really help us with that conversation. So you also have, I mentioned that you were whipping up some great cocktails. You also have a podcast and a business where you do cocktails. And tell us a little bit about that because that wasn't in the bio I just read.
Yeah, so I have a podcast called HR and Cocktails, and it is a podcast that is geared toward business owners and executives, really to just help them understand the various aspects of HR. Many times people think about HR, they're like, oh, it's where people go to get hired and it's where they go to get fired. And there are a lot of things that happen in between there. So the podcast really helps them to understand that. And then also, I talk to my guests about their favorite cocktail. And I make the cocktails and I post them on Instagram on the HR and Cocktails Instagram. And it's really just to help people understand that HR people have fun too. We don't just wear seasonal sweaters and plan parties. I don't even own a seasonal sweater, so you will never catch me out there like that in these streets. Okay. And that we have fun and that we are people too. So it's just to add a little fun twist to HR, which sometimes is a heavy topic.
Absolutely. I love it.
Absolutely.
I
I
think
love it.
it's so creative. Um, and so when we were able to connect and talked about this topic, we just kind of talked about what my expectations were and what your experience was. And one of the things that really came through was that setting expectations regarding going back to work post pandemic, or actually, back in the midst of a pandemic, is really important. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what expectations we should set from an HR perspective.
Sure. And to your point, some of that expectation setting should have been done during the pandemic. Unfortunately, I think that many employers were just in we just want to stay open. We just want to figure out what's happening from day to day mode. So they really didn't have an opportunity to focus on the expectation setting as much as they should have. But now we have, I things have changed since we've had this initial conversation because now we're in the throes of Delta variant, new mask mandates. Things have changed, and it seems like this is an ever evolving conversation. But I think that it's important for employers to communicate, make sure that you are telling people, or if you're a manager or responsible for people, let them know either what to expect or that you don't know, but don't say nothing. People don't know how to operate in a space of not knowing what to expect. So if it's, I don't know if we're going to have mask mandates when you come back into the office. I don't know if we're going to make everybody come back into the office. And then asking people how they feel about it. And then once you do know something, be upfront, be transparent, be honest, and let people know what they can expect. And at the end of the day, when it really comes down to it, private employers can do whatever they want to do, right? So we hear on the news that, courts and Congress and governors and mayors are telling people what they can and can't do, but those are all state and local entities, right? So if you work for the government, if you work for a school system, if you work for even maybe a state medical facility, they can get their direction from those individuals. But the majority of us work for private employers. And private
Mhm.
employers can set whatever expectations they want to. They can request whatever they want to. And the options that you have are to either do it or decide whether or not that's where you want to work in most instances. Now, there are some exceptions, of course. If you have need a medical or religious accommodation for a variety of things, and of course, those things can be helped. But the reality is that when it comes to returning to work, I think it's important for people to set their expectation that the employer can say, I want everybody to come back to work. They can. The employer can say, I want everybody to have a vaccine. They can. Now, from an HR perspective, my advice and counsel to business owners and executives is think about the impact to morale. Think about whether or not it's necessary to do that in your particular environment, whether it be everybody come back to work and everybody get vaccinated, or if you want to come back to work, you must be vaccinated, or everyone has to come back to work, period. Is it necessary? What's the impact to morale? Is this the message that you want to send to your team? So while employers can do these things, my conversation with them is always going to be, is this what you want to do? What's your business reason for doing it? And if you are going to require something like that, be sure to communicate very clearly why you're making this decision, what you expect the outcome to be. Don't just say because I can. I will tell you that the mass resignations are happening. Employers are having very difficult times with retaining employees, and the ones that are doing a really bad job of communicating the plan for return to work, their safety plan, their plan on what they are going to do, particularly for individuals that still have concerns about sending their children back to school.
Yeah.
They're not, if they're not speaking to that, they're having a hard time getting employees to attracting employees to come work for them. So I would just say, from an expectations perspective, employees, just know your employer can set whatever expectations they want to if they're a private employer. But if you are a manager or someone who's responsible for managing people, make sure that you're just communicating clearly on what your plan is, or just communicating that we don't have a plan yet and we'll let you know when we do.
Absolutely. Communication is so key. I was just talking to someone the other day who is an executive in a hospital system and in another state. And the hospital system, the state just mandated that every hospital has to vaccinate their employees. And so she was dealing with a mass exodus of employees threatening to quit because they didn't want to be vaccinated. And she was trying to do what you just suggested in terms of being very clear with the communication and responding to everybody's messages and their concerns and letting them know why this had come down and that, they didn't have any control over it. But that communication was really key because she decided to use a lot of her time and energy on the communication because a lot of people are, quitting and there's mass exodus.
Yeah, they are.
So, when I
So
was looking at your podcast, I noticed that one of your latest episodes is on employee resource groups or affinity groups and how the grassroots approach to return to work can be managed better through some of these groups. So I would love to hear how we can leverage these employee resource groups as we return back to work.
back to work. Yeah, absolutely. And many people, if you worked in larger organizations, you may be familiar with employee resource groups, ERGs, affinity groups. They call them different things. And some of them even call them task forces. So it just depends on your organization what they call it. But these can be a good resource, and when done correctly and when implemented correctly, it's typically something that employees initiate. So it's usually not something that managers and the business creates. It's usually a group of employees with similar interests come together and say, hey, we want to support each other internally and perhaps create recommendations and resources for other people in the organization. Um, ERGs are not exclusive groups, they're inclusive groups, but the goal of each one of those groups is to support whatever the mission of that group is. Historically, so ERGs go back all the way to, the 60s and 70s. Historically, they were, women and Black people, people of color. That's typically what the topic areas for ERGs were. But now we see single moms, working from home, people coming together on a variety of other issues. I homeschool my children, and I'm an executive. How do I manage that? So there are a variety of ERGs that people can pull together to create a conversation. I think it's really important for people to know that they're not the only one dealing with a situation, and just having someone else that you can talk to and say, okay, here's some of the challenges I'm dealing with. And when you hear someone else say, yeah, this is what I've done to address this because I was dealing with the same thing, it can give you new ideas. It can be reinvigorating, and it can also give employees the opportunity to make recommendations to leadership and say, hey, have you thought about this? Did you realize that, these were some of the things, unintended consequences. These things happen all the time from management decisions. Here's some of the unintended consequences. Here's some things that we would like to see change, or here are some of the things that we think we could put in place to make things better for our group of people, whatever that group is. Again, it could be anything. And then it allows leadership to get some of that feedback that they on topics that they might not even be thinking about. during COVID, there was one group of executive directors of nonprofits that had a Facebook group. So that was kind of like, because they are nonprofit executive directors all over. They have a Facebook group, and they came up with this idea around having a, well, other people had this idea too, but they found a pod for their children. So they all created like this safe space for their children to come together in a pod, and they rotated homes each week so that the kids would have a different home to go to, and they stayed in their bubble. Like no one was allowed in that bubble other than those families, and they were able to really manage homeschool because these women were, executives of nonprofits. They couldn't manage the day to day of their children at home and run a nonprofit because nonprofits were tapped out during COVID, many of them. So they created this solution. It was just a grassroots effort. It was just a group of people with similar interests and similar needs that came together to solve a problem. And that's really what an employee resource group is. It's not a place to just go and complain and tell your, job they're doing a horrible job. That's not what it's for. It's really about creating solutions, finding people with similar needs, similar interests to create solutions.
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. And I did hear about one of those pods, and I remember I wanted to get my children into one, but I think that they were full, and I was really sad and disappointed because I thought it would be
Because
nice.
I thought it would be nice. Yeah, I mean, if my child had been younger, I definitely would have explored it. My child's in, she was in fifth grade, but my child is like me. So she's like a little mini self-contained little situation. So she was okay. And to be very honest with you, I was very fortunate. I have a lot of flexibility. So I was able to do a little bit more, and her school was extremely organized, so that helped too. But I definitely would have been seeking out more than just a group for pods. I would have, because I trust me, HR cocktails kept me sane. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Now, I also wanted to know, just in general, what your human resources philosophy is, and a little bit about your story of how you went from sort of working for certain corporations to branching out on your own.
So this story, and I think the story of many entrepreneurs is not a sexy story. It's not sexy at all. So I started my career in HR and recruiting, moved up, worked for very large corporations in leadership positions. And ultimately, when I had my daughter, I realized that I needed to do something different for me. And so I started working for some smaller companies, building out HR departments, building HR infrastructure in smaller companies. And I really enjoyed doing that. And so I went to work for a company where I thought that I would be able to do that in a similar capacity to how I'm doing it now, but more in a consultant role. And I realized very quickly that I had made a mistake and that wasn't where I was supposed to be. So one day I was on the phone and I quit my job. And it wasn't what I woke up to do that morning. It really wasn't. I didn't wake up that morning and say, I'm going to quit my job. I'll quit my job. And I called my husband. I was like, so I was on the phone and I quit my job and I didn't even do that, but I did. But he was very supportive. And so immediately I just went into, okay, all right, let me figure out what I'm going to do. The first thing I decided was, okay, I'm just going to piece together a couple of part-time HR jobs and I'm just going to do that. So I did. And I started partnering with a couple of people who had consulting firms and doing a few things. And then I started to realize, okay, I want to do this, but I want to do this the way that I want to do it. Because when you do consulting and you do things for other people, you have to do it the way that they do it. And that's fair. Um, and along the way, to be very honest with you, when I left corporate, on my way out the corporate door, I realized I was a really bad corporate employee. Not because I didn't do the work, because I did do the work. I was great at that. I was a bad corporate employee because I didn't like playing the games. I just was really bad at that. I'm not really good at that. So I realized that, but then when I was doing some consulting for other people and doing work that I loved for other people, but didn't have the autonomy and the freedom to do it the way that I wanted to, I realized she's actually bad at working for people. That's
Yeah.
actually what it is. It's not even
Right.
about corporate. I just don't need to work for anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
So exactly. So I, put together a couple of clients and really started doing my own thing. I'll be honest, I thought I was going to be a solopreneur forever. I did not plan on starting a business. I just wanted to make money, pay the bills, and not have to clock in somewhere. That was my goal. And I did that for a couple of years, and I was very fortunate that I was able to do that. But one day I decided I was going to get an executive coach because I was like, yeah, I can do a better job of certain things. And so the coach asked me, the very first thing he asked me, he said, "Do you just want to do this forever?" I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" He was like, "Do you want to do this? Eat what you catch every day. And if you don't fish, you don't eat. You want to do this every day for the rest of your life." And I was like, I hadn't even thought about it. I was like, I don't know. I didn't think about that. And so he was like, "Well, you're going to need to get people to help you, to support you, to do some of the other things that either aren't the best use of your time or to help you better support your clients." I was like, "Well, I can't do that. The business is named after me. People want me. They Prescott HR, they want Prescott." And so he said, "When you think about Apple, who do you think about?" I was like, "Of course, you think about Steve Jobs." He was like, "Well,
Right.
Steve Jobs is dead, okay? And Apple has gone on, right? You can have other people work for you and you'll be fine." Um, and after that, I was like, I got it. I got it, and I can do that. Very humbling that this week I had a, a full day team retreat this Tuesday. I have 10 people on my team.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's just very humbling. We planned out our strategy, really looked at what we're gonna do, rolled out a couple of pieces of software, just things to help manage. And now I'm 100% business development. I actually don't consult anymore. I'm just out getting clients. I never saw myself doing that um, for a few reasons because I needed to shift how I thought about a few things. But that was my journey. It was honestly, it was an accident, but I know accidents don't really happen. It needed to happen. It was something that needed to happen, but I didn't plan it. I didn't do all the things that you think that people should do when they start a business. None of those things. I literally was in a parking lot on the phone. It was like, I don't want to work for you anymore.
I love that story.
I love that story.
This time I heard it in a
This
little
time
bit
I
more
heard it in a little
detail.
bit more detail.
And I would just love to
And I
ask
would just
you,
love to
when you
ask.
went from solopreneur to a business where you had employees, how long did that transition take?
It's been 3 years that I've been adding people to my team. Um, and a lot of it has been intentional that I've taken my time. Recently, we've just been growing so much that I have had to speed up my process a little bit. And being very careful that because one of the things about me, and this is something that I'm growing every day as a person, as a professional. I didn't realize how much of a perfectionist I was and how much I needed to see, touch, and approve everything, which is a bad habit. So I'm really working on that.
Micromanager?
What- It's a bad word. I
I
just want it to
know.
look right. um, I I'm growing every day, and I think that for me, it's just the journey was necessary. It was necessary for me to take it slow. It was necessary for me to be involved in the beginning because now I've built out processes, I've built out systems, I've built out things now that if we bring in a new consultant, we can hand them, this is how we do it. This is what it means. This is our value proposition to our clients. My tagline for my business is unintimidated HR. And the story behind Unintimidated is very important to me, is very close to my heart because I always saw myself being a chief HR officer for a Fortune 500 company. I knew I could do it. I knew I was smart enough. I knew I was good enough. I knew I could do it. One day, and I worked for the largest staffing agency in the world. I was two levels below the president of the company. The founder of the company owns the Ravens. And I went to lunch one day with one of the VPs, and he told me, he said, even if your manager got hit by a bus, I'd never promote you. So,
Wow.
that's something to hear, you know? So I
Yeah.
said, "Oh, okay. Well, explain that to me. Help me understand that." And he said, "Because you're intimidating." And I
Mm.
said, "Okay. Well, what does that mean?" Because I didn't know what to do with that. I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, I mean, people just always feel like they need to bring their A game when they're around you, and you just use a lot of big words."
Whoa.
Yeah. So in that moment, I didn't roll my eyes because I internalized it in that moment. Now I'm like, okay. But in that moment, it crushed me. I
Mhm.
internalized it. I was like, I don't I don't know what that means. I don't know where that puts me. After I left corporate, well, so I told my husband this story. I told my husband this story when it happened, and he was like, okay. And I started to hear, intimidating a few more times there. So one day my husband brought me a Dale Earnhardt hat. I'm like, Dale Earnhardt? Who watches NASCAR? Nobody wants a Dale Earnhardt hat. He said, well, read it. Dale Earnhardt's nickname was the Intimidator. And I have this hat right here. It's at my desk. I look at it every day. On the side of it, it says the Intimidator. And he said, if that's what you are, that's what you are. Own it. It's up to them whether they allow you or let they allow themselves to be intimidated. Now, my husband
Mm.
always the deep one, in the family, but he came through on that one. So
He definitely came through.
came through on that one. So I have this, and when I think about my team and my philosophy for what we do, we are unintimidated HR in that we are going to do and say what needs to be done and said. We're going to tell you what you need to know and not what you want to hear. And we're not for everybody, and I'm okay with that. And that was something that I had to learn that I'm not for everybody, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. That is a great
That
story,
is
and
a
I'm
great
so
story.
glad that you shared it because I love what your husband said about it's up to them whether or not they're going to be intimidated. And for somebody to think that it is not an asset for people to bring their A game when you're around. Wow. I mean, I've been talking to people and we've been talking about the mediocrity um, that gets promoted and that gets put on a pedestal in this country. And that is a prime example of just, wanting to promote mediocrity. So that explains very clearly what your human resources philosophy is. And it also leads into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is diversity and inclusion, and how we as Black women who are either in corporate or in another employment situation, how can we um, really navigate this space. Because on the one hand, everybody wants a Black woman on their team because it's the end thing to do. But on the other hand, racism and pay inequity and all of those things are still real. So, what's your advice about us navigating the DEI space?
Yeah, states. Yeah, I think for me, it's difficult for me to answer that question, and not really be jaded, to be honest. I have a really good friend who still works in corporate. She's worked her way up the ladder. She's earned it. She deserves it. And I think about it, and I'm like, I don't know how you do that every day. I just don't know how you do that every day because she still has to play the game. She still has to think about all those things. And so it is interesting to me that it still has to happen. What I will say is that we are making progress as it relates to that. I mean, the fact that last year they had to pass a law to allow people to wear their hair the way it grows out of their head, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Why in 2020 did we have to pass a law that said you can wear your hair the way it comes out your head? Like that was just amazing to me. But in navigating that space, I think you have to ask yourself, how much heat do you really want to have to handle, right? Because that's going to really determine how big of a stand you take. And listen, I'm not here to say you need to take any type of stand, because stand I took was just to leave. So I can't say anything to anybody. Okay. What kind of stand do you want to take? Because the more vocal you are, the more heat you have to take. And that's fine if that's what you want to do, because you will make an impact for other people. You will move the needle for other people. But the other thing that I'll say in navigating that space is don't work out of emotion. Don't work out of emotion, because that's the weapon that they always use against us. We're the angry Black woman. You just get so emotional. Use facts and use big words, because apparently it triggers them. Um, so, um, but just deal in facts and try not to bring your emotions into it, and bring solutions. Um, I see so many times people who have the right direction. It could have gone the right way, but then it went off the rails because either they were too emotional, they wanted to speak on behalf of other people. You just have to focus on the impact to you, what it is that you want to see, and not bring emotion into it. And that's hard to do because it's emotional. I know that when I left corporate, I had PTSD. It was emotional. I had to go to therapy. I rode past that building, taking my daughter to school every day for almost 3 years. I flipped off the building every time I walked past it, rode past it. Okay. I understand it's emotional. Okay. But in that moment, when you're trying to express yourself and you're trying to get your point across, you got to play their game, unfortunately, in order to be heard. Now, that doesn't mean that you're sacrificing the message, but in order to be heard, the message needs to be palatable. And don't mean they're going to do anything about it. So I don't know if that answers the question. And again, it's hard for me because, like I said, I just decided it wasn't for me to play that game, and I left. But people can do it. I've seen people be successful at it.
You mentioned
You
that
mentioned
you have a
that
friend who's
you
still
have
in
a friend who's
corporate,
still in.
and when you look at the experiences she's going through, you can't believe that she's going through it. Do you do you see negative effects on her for the experiences that she's going through, or do you feel like she's mastered what you're saying, sort of taking the emotion out of it and playing the game on their terms, and is just kind of able to get through it?
She's mastered it, and for her, it's a game inside of the game. And
Mm.
so she looked at her watch and she had time today. I did not. So and so for her, it's a game inside of the game. And so she gets something out of managing that and moving and maneuvering in that space. Um, and she's been successful at it. And she's been able to, and one other thing that I will say about that, and particularly how she was able to do that well, she found allies and she built strong
Mm.
relationships with them.
Yeah.
And they were able to speak on her behalf when she was not in the room. And there were plenty of times before she got where she is, where she wasn't in the room, and those people had to speak for her. And when you don't have those allies and you don't build those relationships, then that's when you can miss out on opportunities. I'll be honest, I didn't do that. And that's the one thing I took out of that situation that I could have done differently, is that I could have built relationships with people differently instead of lumping everybody into a category. She's done a very good job of identifying those people that she strategically needs, and honestly, using them to her advantage.
Mhm.
Mhm,
Mhm.
mhm.
Now that's real talk right
That's
there. I
real
think
talk right
that
there. I
that
think
is
that.
crucial because even the way you describe the situation, it's impossible to do that on your own. You have to have some sort of allies or some sort of system or support or underground network or something to kind of gird you up in that to be able to go into that situation every day. So I think that that is a great observation. And I know for me, I always knew I didn't want to work in corporate because I am not good at that at all. Not good at the game. So I'll leave that to the masters, the Jedis. I'll let them do
I'll
that.
let them do that. And that's what she is. She's like Yoda. She's real good at it.
Good. We need people in all places who can do all things. Um, so I just wanted to say for the community, the SOAR Circle community, if you have any questions or comments about this topic, if you have something you want to contribute, we're just talking about the human resources experience or conversation on human resources aspect of going back to work post COVID and what our expectations should be. So I would love to hear you contribute. You can type your comments or your questions in the chat, and then we'll be able to bring them up on screen and talk about those as well. The other thing that I wanted to ask you while we're waiting for people to comment is, what advice do you give companies about making the transition to work smoother um, for their employees? I know earlier you mentioned communication is key, but is there any other advice that you give to employers? I'm sorry.
4 years, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really important is really understanding the needs of your employee base and understanding the type of support that they need. Understand that there are some people that are still uncomfortable with returning to work. Again, now with the Delta variant, I have a daughter that's not quite 12, so she can't get vaccinated. So I have to keep that in mind, even though I'm vaccinated. So I'm more careful. Not that I wasn't, but as a vaccinated person, I think we, take a few more liberties than we did before. Uh, and so now thinking about, okay, now, am I going to actually eat in a restaurant now where I did all before now, once I got vaccinated, but now am I going to eat in a restaurant? Well, do I want to go into an office where everybody says, okay, I'm vaccinated, so everybody in the conference room, let's take our mask off? Well, that doesn't mean that we might not have COVID and I can't bring it back home to my 11-year-old. So thinking about what people are thinking about the PTSD of everything that has happened. One of my podcasts that I did maybe 2 or 3 months ago was about grief, but grief from the context of any type of significant change in your life, right? And that can trigger grief feelings. So grief is not just loss. And so how people are experiencing that and how that shows up when they come to work, whether their lack of focus. I've been home with my child for the last year. I don't know how they're doing at school with the mask on. So many things that people are dealing with. So thinking about that and being sensitive to that, being sensitive to the fact that people have been home in sweatpants for a year and a half, and now they got to put on shoes. My feet did not know what to do when I put shoes on. My feet were like, we ain't doing this, girl. So I'll get you some open toe shoes because we're not doing it. So, thinking about that, do they have to come to work 5 days a week? Can they come to work 3 days a week? And then, alternate. So just being sensitive to the needs of people and really identifying, do we have a true business reason to say everybody come back to work every day? And think about whether or not your reason that you're doing that, because this is what I found when COVID first happened. Employers were stressed and upset because they actually didn't have a real way to measure what people were doing.
Mhm.
They didn't have metrics, they didn't have goals, they didn't have a way to determine whether people were effective, efficient, and successful. So their answer was, well, just bring everybody back to work. Well, that's not the answer. What we've identified is a gap. Let's find a way to resolve that and solve for that. And in that, a lot of employers realize we actually can shrink our office footprint. We don't need to have as many seats. Everybody doesn't need to come to work. So I would just say doing that analysis, understanding what people's needs are, and being sensitive to that and creating solutions around that. Do you have a real business need? Do you?
Yeah.
And many times the answer is no.
And when is it acceptable for employees to kind of push back and say, hey, can you revisit your open toe shoe policy? Can you revisit me having to come in here 5 days a week? Can I just come in 2 days a week? Like, how much pushback? Because earlier you said that, the employers can do whatever the employers decide is appropriate for their company, and you have a choice to stay or leave. But how can we empower employees to get their needs met?
That's a good question. And what I will say is it depends on the culture of the organization. It depends on how progressive the leadership is. Similar to the things that we see play out on the political stage where there's totalitarianism. I just have power, so I'm just going to use it. Those dynamics play out in the workforce as well. So there are some organizations that do a really good job of representative government. And you know what? I heard what you said, so I'm going to implement that. So some of it's really going to be based on what the culture of your organization, the openness of the organization to receive that. Employees typically know that. They can typically sense that. So even if they're not sure, there's a way that you can do it. I would say, having a conversation and saying, have we thought about whether or not we can do 3 days a week? This is how I propose. This is one thing I will always recommend to anyone. If you have a recommendation or a concern or you see an issue, always bring a proposal to the table.
Mhm.
They might not use it. They might say, well, okay, that we won't do it like that, but this is a great place to start. When you just bring problems, usually it will get shut down. And so I could tell you that as a manager, as a person who receives complaints from all over the place, I'm just kind of like, okay, so what is it that you want? What is your ask? Go to the table with your ask, and you will find that it will be received much better. So do that. Say, hey, I'd like to propose that maybe our team, you know, work 3 days a week. We can alternate. We'll make sure that all of these things are covered. There'll never be a day where somebody's not in the office. Kind of just put together a plan
Mhm.
and present it. And you never know if it will be, accepted or not. It's always worth a try. But what I will always say is that, you catch more honey with bees. I mean, more bees with honey. That's it. No, you don't want to catch honey with bees. You will catch more bees with honey. And so, that's one thing that I know that I had to learn even for myself, is that I could be right and have the best idea, but if I brought it to the table with venom, nobody was going to hear it.
Hmm. It's just like what they say in marriages: do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And you can be
Exactly.
both, but sometimes you have to choose. Um, so I just wanted to thank our one of our listeners. She is also an HR professional and really appreciates us having this conversation. So I appreciate you commenting. And if there are any other things, situations that you've encountered that you have pearls that you want to share, feel free. Um, because we like to hear from everybody and get a wide range of views. That's one of the beauties of being able to have these conversations. Now, we talked a little bit, you talked about grief, and I also did see the podcast episode that you did on grief. And, mental health is at the top of everybody's conversations, at the top of everybody's mind. It is real. I know I'm seeing a lot of anxiety, even just in the urgent care. They may be coming in for a hurt toe, but underneath that hurt toe, there is a ton of anxiety. And so mental health is really a big issue. And we've seen it on the national stage with Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka. So since we know that this pandemic and going back to work can be triggering to folks and they have a grief experience, what should we what can employers do, for one, in terms of supporting their employees? What would be the ideal? Because I know it feels like they don't know what to do from what I can see. Because I feel like my employer just wants everybody to just keep going, like nothing ever happened. Just keep going, keep going, keep going. Um, and then any other thoughts you have around the mental health issues as an HR expert?
Yeah, in the healthcare field and in the social work field and other, clinical fields, they really do a lot of trauma informed care, which I think is something that actually could be trauma informed management is what we need to have.
Mhm.
in the workplace. Because at the end of the day, I think that managers are not given the tools. I don't, in my experience, I think in many instances, it's not that people don't want to do the right thing, they don't know how. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to do that. And so their default is, well, this is what the policy says. Well, this is what we do. Well, I can't make any exceptions because they don't know what to do. I think it's imperative for employers and other HR people to make sure that they are providing tools and resources to those managers to help facilitate those conversations. If you have someone who's constantly calling out, someone who's sleeping in, or it just, constantly leaving early, is frazzled, not showing up the way they used to show up, don't assume that they're just lazy. I mean, we don't want to open any doors and we don't want to ask questions, like, you got a disability? You got something going on? We don't want to do that now. I'm not saying do that. Don't do that. But what I'm saying is that, just say, I've noticed that, you're showing up a little bit differently than you had before. Let me offer some resources to you. We have the EAP. We have, we got a yoga room, we got a meditation room, whatever resources you have, make sure that people are aware of those resources, so that they can take advantage of them. I think that many times, and just, I also feel that organizations need to empower their managers to just say, hey, why don't you just go ahead and take the rest of the day? Because it just seems like you need some time. I know, this is not the same example, but this was really stressful for me. I had postpartum depression after I had my daughter. It was really bad. So when I got off of work, I would get in my car and I would drink coffee and I would listen to a book and I would literally sit in the parking lot of the daycare until 5 minutes before it closed because I needed that time. I was like, and if I felt guilty, but then I felt good because I was like, ooh, I got like 20 extra minutes, right? So
Right.
sometimes, sometimes, um, people just need an extra minute. Like, hey, why don't you just leave a few minutes early? Why don't you go get a coffee, or why don't you go out, get some fresh air, walk around, take a minute. Allowing managers to feel like they can do that, that's not promoting, people feeling that that people aren't working or they're not trying. But we
Mhm.
all know that people receive things differently, people respond to things differently, and allowing people to do that, and providing them with those resources, and more importantly, helping managers to understand how to respond, and how to deal with people who are having challenges, not just telling them, well, if you don't come to work, then you don't have a job. Like, okay, there's probably about 10 degrees between what them not having a job and you giving them everything they want. And so, we can probably find somewhere in the middle.
Right. So you alluded to this earlier. When we first talked about this topic, we were talking about returning to work after COVID, right? After the pandemic. But now we find ourselves in the midst of a fourth surge. So we're not really after the pandemic. We're kind of muddling through. So seeing that we're still like in the midst of a fourth surge, what do you see as the best approach that employers can take? Um, is it best for us to for everybody to go back? I know a lot of people are planning to go back physically in September. Is it best to just do that so that people can make that transition and be there and then kind of deal with it on the ground? Or is it best to postpone it? Just what are your thoughts now that we're kind of back in COVID a little bit?
Yeah, I think we had a little bit of sense of security, like April and May. Everybody was like, "Yay, we get to go back outside." Um, it's not a blanket answer, to be honest. It can't be a blanket answer. It really has to be based on the organization, the structure of that organization, the resources that they have. I think a lot of organizations did a no, I can't say that. I think that a lot of organizations tried to build some resources for people to work effectively remotely. Um, I think really organizations need to look at their structure, their resources, how their workforce is set up, and they have to make that decision based on that. I don't think it's just a one size fits all. I also don't think that we can just, that employers should just say everybody comes back to work. Employers get very comfortable in saying, well, what we do for one person, we have to do for everybody. So everybody has to come back to work. That's not true. Everybody that's in like situations, if I'm a call center person, I need to be in the call center. Okay. Unless you can have a way to, allow me to use the queue, from a system at home. But if I am, a person that's just doing, accounting in QuickBooks online, do I physically need to be in the office? No, I don't. So, and you can differentiate those two. So being practical, not just taking the road of saying, well, everybody has to come in because I got to treat everybody the same, and really doing that hard work. And that's what I have found, is that the hard work of having to figure out who should stay, who should go, how do we divide this, how do we do that, how do we manage the logistics of having 3 people in the office, how do we do that? I think that that work has to be done. But unfortunately, I don't have a blanket answer about what's the best way, because the best way is really going to be based on the organization.
And that makes sense. It's not a one size fits all. And I think I'm very comfortable with that. Um, we do have a question for you. And the question is coming from E. Bloxton. How valuable have you found executive coaches to be? Can they also be effective for mid level managers?
Well, I will tell you that my executive coach has been invaluable. I had one executive coach at first, I switched to another. My current one, she focuses on women entrepreneurs. So, I find her to be extremely helpful for me because I have bright, shiny object syndrome, and she helps to manage that. Um, I will say that yes, mid-level managers can get value from an executive coach, but I think that the organization has to define what competencies they want to see developed as a result of the executive coaching. So there needs to be a plan for what the outcomes need to be and what that person needs to develop. But mid-level managers can absolutely be helped, particularly if they're being groomed for executive positions. And it needs to be very clear what the competencies are that need to be developed.
Okay, that is a great answer. And on this show, on SOAR, on my SOAR podcast, I always ask all my guests about their limiting beliefs. And you have kind of stepped out there and you've done some really brave, scary things. You're an entrepreneur, you started your own business, you've scaled it, all of those great things. So, what limiting beliefs came up for you in the process and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that and really trying to narrow that down. Honestly, I think it was building myself back up and believing that I was good enough after leaving corporate. I really doubted whether or not I was as good as I thought I was, because I'm tell you, I thought I was great. But they did a real good job of knocking me down off my pedestal. Um, and so really taking a step back and looking at what they wanted me to believe was my weakness, and refining it and really making sure that my superpower was really a superpower and using it for good and not for evil.
That's a great analogy. Yes, because sometimes we can use our superpowers for nefarious things, right? Awesome.
Yes.
And I would love for you to share any things that you have coming up in terms of your business, how we can listen to your podcast, how we can follow you, how we can support you, all of that good stuff.
Yes. So my website is prescotthr.com. And you can also find links to all of our social media. We're on all social media for Prescott HR, which is the HR business. And then HR and Cocktails is the podcast. You can listen to it on any streaming media. So Apple, Google, Spotify, but you can also get to it from Prescott HR on that website. You click on the podcast link, it'll take you right to it, and you can listen to any of our episodes. And the HR and Cocktails the HR and Cocktails Instagram has all the pictures of fabulous drinks that I make and drink.
And those pictures are
And those
fabulous.
pictures.
I follow your Instagram and I just drool over those pictures. I'm like, can she just come to my house and make them for me though, right? Because they look so
They
good.
look so good. Thank you.
You're welcome. I did have one follow-up question about the executive coaching. How did you find your executive coaches?
They were referred to me by other business owners and professionals that I respected. So they were referred to me. And one thing that I will say is just because somebody really likes their executive coach, just like a therapist or doctor or anything else, they might not be the right one for you. So definitely you should feel comfortable in making sure you find the one that works for you because that's where you're going to get the most out of it.
Okay, great. I definitely agree with that. I believe in the power of threes. I usually have at least three referrals for anything before I make a decision. Well, this has been a great conversation, a really fun conversation, which I knew it would be. Just, having met you the one time, just sensing your energy, I knew it was going to be a fun conversation, but also very, very informative. So I really appreciate you um, giving your time and pouring into all of us with this wonderful information. And I just wanted to say thank you. If there are any final questions or comments, please put those into the chat as we wrap up our conversation for the evening.
And while we're waiting for those to come in, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me and thank you everyone for tuning in and listening.
Thanks. All
Thanks.
right. Well, you have a good evening. Stay cool. It's very hot outside. And I look forward to us just kind of running into each other at the third or just, collaborating, doing things together. That would be awesome.
Awesome. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's where I'll be. You'll be able to find me right there on the waterfront.
All right. Good night.
Okay, good night. All right. Thank you. Good night.